tell
This
you a little bit
conference will now be recorded.
tell you a little bit about Endpoint, and then we'll get into more about what does this look like at scale? What is emotional intelligence? What does it look like when we have it at scale, and how can we hopefully achieve these things? So there's my smiling face. I always feel like it's weird to look at myself while I'm talking. Again, my name is Conrad Moore. I'm the VP of Learning and Development here at Endpoint. I have a kind of zigzaggy career path, but it's all been in either education or business. I actually started as a high school teacher, also did some curriculum development and programs with the district here in San Francisco. Started a nonprofit after that, managed that for 3 years, and now I'm still on the board there. So I kind of started my career in two very different arenas in terms of the type of experience that I was gathering with no real intention other than I just wanted to help out. And then uh, kind of transitioned into the world of learning and development from there. I had dipped my fingers in just through, staff development, at my own organization, bringing in training programs or running my own trainings, collaborating with external organizations. So, and I really enjoyed training. It kind of got me back into the classroom in fun and interesting ways. And then started to move into my next organization where I took on a couple different leadership roles. I headed up operations as well as the professional development department. And so all this was kind of leading towards me um, developing kind of a deep interest in extended learning initiatives, building skills and competencies over time. It was a way for me to connect with people, and again, just to help out. That's kind of one of the main things I enjoy in life. So that's the weird, wild path that's brought me to this point here at Endpoint. Where I similarly build learning programs, and this is a great opportunity for me here to do something that's a little more custom and targeted. We do have our own courseware and materials, but typically our engagements are highly customized to fit very unique client needs. So this is kind of me really getting to enjoy every aspect of my career that I've had the luck and fortune to experience so far. So yeah, I've worked at this point kind of with any organization, industry size you can think of, from government agencies to Fortune 500 companies, tech, biotech, whatever. You can kind of, if you can imagine it, I've probably done something somewhere, retail. So it's fun work and I enjoy it. And I would say that though for a long time I didn't have the language um, to express or really understand a lot of this stuff. Emotional intelligence is something that I've leaned on throughout my life. I would say I naturally just, I think through happenstance and again, maybe good fortune, always found myself in either professional communities or, social communities where emotional intelligence was highly valued and well practiced. And so those were kind of behavior. Once later, once I realized what all that stuff was, I thought, oh, okay, a lot of this stuff resonates and makes sense to me. So I'll kind of, if it seems relevant, weave in some stories throughout, but try to make this as informational as possible for you. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Um, we'll start by just trying to understand, what does emotional intelligence look like at scale? I think most of us are familiar with the term. Um, I'll do a little brief bit on it just in case somehow you're a newcomer, but this stuff's been around in the business world for decades now, so I think we've all at least heard of it. But we're really here to talk about, what does this look like when we try to attack it at the macro level, when we really try to build an organization that's thriving through improved emotional intelligence. We'll talk about that. We'll take a little bit of time to talk about, why don't we have this already? What's getting in the way? I have my favorite thing that when I ask people about, what do you like about working at your job, and people say, I'm surrounded by really smart people, and I don't, I don't doubt them, but I also think that there can often be something missing where, yes, you have really smart people. Have we figured out how to get them to connect effectively, to transcend just their technical, analytical skills, and really turn that into collaboration, productivity, and community, and a sense of belonging. So we'll talk a little bit about why you might be surrounded by really smart people, and yet you're not seeing some of these amazing characteristics that we would hope to get at. We'll do kind of an overview of a typical program that we would use to scale emotional intelligence, and then we'll open it up at the end to Q&A. Again, I'll try to get you out of here in under an hour. I know you all have lives. It's the end of the year. Everyone's probably scrambling to get everything done before we all take a nice extended break, hopefully. So real quick, this is just really to help me tailor the conversation a little bit more to our audience. If you could share what formal emotional intelligence initiatives you are currently running, or you've run in the past in your organization, or even if it's just previous in my career, like, yeah, I took a class one time, or, I just like to see, I've seen a million different emotional intelligence initiatives, some more effective than others. So I'd be really curious to see what you've seen. Okay, so for Sean, that wasn't something that was focused on. And I should also say, I've seen that too. It does feel very ethereal sometimes, so it's hard to pin down. Anybody else been to a training class or even a series of trainings? To what degree are you familiar with this kind of work that's being done? I can always share my own war stories. Something typical might be, I would say most, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later as we get into this, but the most common way I've seen this addressed, if at all, is we run a couple trainings, and that's kind of it. And absolutely, I think training and education should be a part of any emotional intelligence initiative, but it can't be the only part, because we're talking about behavior change. And I think if we have any other L&D professionals in the room, we know that doesn't just happen after you go to one training. All right, so let's talk about what does this look like at scale, first of all. And the short answer is you kind of already know what this looks like. It's just the degree to which you experience it. But emotional intelligence at scale, we would expect to see effective interpersonal communication. And I think that at once seems to speak for itself, but I want to get a little more granular on this when we talk about effective interpersonal communication. I'm going to get a little abstract here for a second, but communication is really the process through which I put whatever lives inside of my brain into your brain. And that it is impossible for that to be 100% accurate. We don't have telepathy, or I don't have telepathy. And if any of you have telepathy, I think you should teach us because I don't know how to do that. But since it's impossible for me to beam a thought into your head, at least so far in 2018, we have to use different processes and mechanisms to convey that information. And so there's something that's always lost. I'm the only me, you're the only you. We have different worldviews. Our command of, currently the English language may or may not be the same. And so there's all these little barriers that interfere with us effectively and accurately communicating. But with emotional intelligence, we have, and I'll get to this momentarily, but deeper relationships. So we have practices that can help us kind of cut through more quickly to the heart of the matter. And so this is at once what I'm communicating as well as how I'm communicating, with the goal being we get to a mutual understanding faster, and we have the skills to overcome challenges, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. So being an effective communicator is maybe shortening the time, the the distance between my mind and yours. So that's one thing that we would see a lot. So if you see, a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, ultimately, could lead to conflict or at least friction. That might be an area to focus on. Deeper relationships. Of course, any relationship takes time, but we also want to give people the skills to learn how to speed that time up. And also make that relationship go deeper than just the surface. I want to be able to understand how you think, what you value, what your priorities are, and be able to factor all of those things into account when we interact with each other. And that's between you and me, but that's also between teams. So we want to understand the team culture in another team or another department, what's important to them, how they like to operate. Because that will absolutely affect the way that we interact. And I can even use that as pre-planning. So if I'm going to, initiate contact with you over a particular issue, I want to be able to think about your world and how you operate in it so I can find the best way to interact with you. All this stuff leads to better collaboration. I want to also zero in on that word collaboration for a minute, because I don't actually think one thing I learned quickly as I got into the world of business is how the business world likes to kill really good words. I feel like I can't use that word synergy ever again. And collaboration is another one that I think we need to talk about in a more honest fashion. Collaboration is not sticking people into a group and asking them to produce next to each other. In fact, I think what you would see a lot of the time is back and forth compromising. True collaboration is we're able to build on top of each other's ideas. You have a good idea. I love that. That makes me think of this. I don't think that we'll ever see, any relationship that doesn't have some kind of compromise. But true collaboration is rare, and it comes through that deep relationship and effective interpersonal communication, understanding each other and how to get straight to the point so we can start producing in ways that we're both satisfied with, or as a group. All right. And then we would hopefully see a more positive work environment for a few reasons. People would generally know how to control their emotions, manage their emotions a little bit better, communication flowing more readily, deeper relationships, collaboration is more effective. So all of this would lead to the work experience feeling better. Less friction in the environment, less frustration. That doesn't mean all that stuff goes away. Work is not vacation. So, that's not a silver bullet to solve work stress, but it can absolutely reduce it, as well as reducing conflict, or, making conflict easier to manage. So this should all be relatively familiar to a lot of you. Just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page there, so I won't spend too much time on this. I'll throw some quick stats at you, and then I'll actually share as well some data that we've seen what it looks like when emotional intelligence is prioritized and considered as an important value to be dealt with in an organization, at scale. So some quick stats for you. Emotional intelligence outperforms IQ 70% of the time. Don't need to go too deep into the neuroscience right now, but a lot of this has to do with the way that your brain processes information about its environment. And so all of that data travels through the emotional centers of your brain first. So you might be a highly analytical person, very logical, rational, all those things. But those thoughts follow your emotional response. And so people who understand that emotional experience is a primary part of how we interpret the world around us, and then access that part of themselves and others to move people forward. We'll be able to draw out more of the value of those kind of more technical skills, analytical skills that absolutely are important. But there's a human component to all this as well. 90% of top performers are highly emotionally intelligent. I think that's pretty well known stat. And some areas where we would see emotional intelligence being a strong indicator of performance, decision making, right? We could think of being cool under pressure, communication, stress tolerance, teamwork, change tolerance, customer service. I think if any of you have ever been in a customer facing role, especially if, like me, perhaps in college, you waited tables, I would bet that some of the most emotionally intelligent people in your organization are customer service if you have that function. And then trust, really trust being the faith that my brain has that I can predict your behavior in a way that you will behave in a way that is positive to me and mutually respectful. So those are some of the fun stuff. Again, I imagine at this point in 2018, since we've been doing this stuff collectively as a species for decades now, this type of stuff is probably familiar to you. What are some real world examples? I'll just kind of run through some quick high level fun stories for you. You can find out more of those if you want. There's the source at the bottom of the screen, but the Air Force used emotional intelligence as a criteria for selecting who their recruiters were. And that actually ended up saving them $3 million annually, which, if you look at the big Air Force budget, that might be a drop in the water, but that's not insignificant. Meaning that they were able to, by choosing emotionally intelligent recruiters, those recruiters were able to more quickly assess appropriate candidates for various programs, which can reduce the amount of training and development time and job fitment. Totally different example, partners in a multinational consulting firm who scored higher in emotional intelligence delivered $1.2 million more than other partners. So again, a totally different field, but we see this as a strong indicator of performance. 300 top-level execs from 15 global companies. An analysis of those executives showed that there were 6 emotional competencies that they were analyzing, and those who performed stronger in those or had higher scores in those competencies were higher performers. And then lastly, managers of financial advisors at American Express went through an EI training program, and they studied the cohort that went through that program and the cohort that did not. And the managers who did go through that program, their financial advisors grew their businesses by 18.1% compared to the 16.2% for those who were not trained. So why? What's happening here? And I mentioned this earlier, right? Emotion precedes thought and informs our worldview and decision making. So, if all of these people had higher emotional intelligences in all of these different examples, they would have greater knowledge of themselves and others, which means they know how to motivate themselves when they need to, be self-starters, take initiative, deal with the stresses and pressures and challenges of work, as well as inspire other people, right? If I know what's important to you, what you value, the things that make you react positively, and I integrate that into our relationship conversation, I can increase both of our productivity. More effective communication, we've spoken about this, and greater emotional control and social effectiveness. Social effectiveness is a major part, by the way, of being a strong leader. It's that understanding of you yourself and the context in which you're operating. So it's maybe delivering a speech to the entire organization or to your department, or even a one-on-one negotiation. It's understanding the little nuances and reactions, priorities, values of the moment, and kind of adjusting your approach based on them. And we see this, people who are high in emotional intelligence do this very naturally. But we can also kind of proceduralize what gets them to that point where it becomes more of a reflex than something that they're practicing. So that's what a lot of this is about. So I think, again, a lot of you are probably familiar with the value and import of all this stuff. So I don't want to spend too much time here. Let's talk about, why don't we have this? I have, again, smart people everywhere. Why aren't they emotionally intelligent? And the short answer might be that they are. A big problem I see very often in terms of why am I smart, emotionally intelligent people, that's not translating into productivity, is underdeveloped emotional intelligence in key power centers of the organization. And that may just be shorthand for leadership. Very often, emotional intelligence initiatives come from the top down, but are not engaged in at the top. Emotional intelligence and stuff that fall under that umbrella, like communication, are always, or interpersonal skills, whatever people are calling it, are always, top 3 to 5 skills that leadership wants employees trained in, but it's also not something that they always engage in themselves, try to develop, reflect, understand. And so it can't really work if we don't all agree from top to bottom that this is important, or that we understand how it works and where we all need to improve. So that would be, I would say, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen a lot of organizations trying to engage in the development of their staff. Connected to that, this could be the same thing. This could be a challenge for leaders, but it also happens at any individual level, and that's egocentricity, right? The idea that I get this, whatever this is, I understand, I have some important perspective or knowledge or belief that nobody else has. And so there's a lack of self-reflection. And sometimes that can be the case, right? You can absolutely be right and still be wrong, in terms of the way that you operate in the context of the social setting that you're in. So egocentricity, and then attached to that, or a similar concept would be sociocentricity. So you could think of this a lot like tribalism. My team or my friends or my family, whatever social group you're a part of, has more correct beliefs, ways of being, ways of acting, ways of approaching work, doing work, etc., that are superior or that takes into account XYZ more than what we see in other teams. So these are kind of the squishy, soft cultural aspects that get in the way in a lot of organizations. But, and this is probably part of it, there may be structural or systemic challenges as to why your emotional intelligence program may be falling short. And this kind of hints at the idea that if you really want to engage in an emotional intelligence development endeavor in your organization, no matter how large, there's deep work to be done here. And it could be some combination of all of these factors. So, we try to counsel people, because I think the traditional approach is, well, let's just throw some people in a training class. And that's not that does nothing. And if that's what you want to do, fine, I'll give you a training class. But that will be minimally effective. If we actually believe that this will bring value to our organization, we have to be willing to look at everything to really improve what goes on. So, having said all of that, okay, this is why we may not be able to, why that one training class I did that one time didn't work. So what does work? How can we actually scale emotional intelligence? Our approach is a phased approach. It's pretty adaptive and involves a fair amount of consultation. If you just want straight out of the box, training programs, we have that too. We have some courseware that we can kind of partner with you on, if you're already running your own program. But I'll take you through, nose to tail, what we would do. So this phased approach starts with phase 1 at the individual level, and I'll get into these in a little more detail in a second here. But we would come in and assess and educate individuals, figure out, create some baselines, and then from there, educate and try to develop some kind of learning path to develop those skills. Phase 2 is to develop team strategies. Now that we have kind of a baseline group of people who have general understanding, have probably taken some steps on the path, we need to up the focus to the team level. So I'll talk about, again, what team strategies look like in a moment. And then finally, I say org strategies, it could be department strategies. It kind of really depends on the size of your organization and the the degree of change that you're trying to affect. And that may not even be known to you at this point, but we can kind of help you with that through assessing and talking about the areas where emotional intelligence might be effective for you. So let's look at these three phases a little bit closer. At the individual level, again, we start with baseline assessments. Probably some of you, if not most or all of you, have heard of Daniel Goleman. There are many frameworks out there for emotional intelligence. His is the most ubiquitous, and I don't really have any problems with it anyway. So we use that framework. There's 4 competencies, and then beneath that, 12 elements that you would work on, that are essentially, your ability to understand and really manage yourself, and then your ability to understand others and manage your relationships. So there's kind of an internal and external piece to that. Most of us are probably familiar with that. If you're not, sorry to give it such short shrift. Time being what it is, I kind of want to move on. But so we start with a baseline based on those 4 competencies. And then for individuals, we identify growth areas. There's a baseline education that needs to happen so everybody can all speak a common language. But then, of course, each person's unique. So we would design a learning plan based on that. There would probably be some general trainings that everyone would go through, but then the reinforcement plan, we use a lot of reinforcement strategies and coaching in our learning plan. So those will be specific to the individual based on what we've seen both in the assessment and potentially in any classroom environment. So training, reinforcement, ongoing coaching, and then a final assessment to figure out what changed, what improved. And that starts to, part of what we're doing at Endpoint this whole time as well is also getting to learn more deeply your organization and how it works. A lot of times when you run programs like these, you start to hear in the ongoing interactions with participants, what are the real structural, systemic, or cultural issues at play here that really need some help. And so that kind of informs the planning of the next phase, which is the team level. So we start with managers collecting feedback on emotional intelligence from the team, as well as us. We kind of provide ongoing reporting on what we've seen, where we started, where we've come, what does that mean? But also we want the participants to have an equal voice in their experience. And we want to elevate emotional intelligence to the discussion level, not just some training that you went to that one time, but something that we agree is important to the team. Suggesting that you designate an EI leader who is not the manager. I'm not saying it shouldn't be the manager, but this is an opportunity to empower people. And this can also drive the more democratic aspects of a good learning program. Sometimes it's easier for me to tell my colleague, my peer, how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, than it is to tell my boss. It's not a requirement, but it's definitely, in either case, we want somebody who's kind of going to be the point person for this program. It could be the manager, and in a lot of that, we can make suggestions based on the dynamics that we see in the teams. If you have a more authoritative manager, that may or may not be the right person versus someone who's a little more collaborative, but that's something we can work on. Then we start doing 360 assessments. So we would take teams and have them assess themselves and the other teams that we're working with. So what do you think you're like to work with? What are the things that are important to you? How do you know? Why? All that stuff. And then ask another team, what do you see in that team over there? What is it like to work with them? What do you think is important to them? How do they like to operate? And the goal there would be to figure out, like, okay, so where are the strengths and weaknesses of the team interactions? And where are the strengths and weaknesses of the dynamics within the teams? So then we can start building learning strategies around that. This can include things like team norms for how we communicate with each other, how we deal with conflict. You can get really high level or low level. Every team's different, so the types of team norms, and these are collaborative, co-created by the team. They're different depending on the type of team, the type of organization. And then inter-team norms. There's kind of an analog for this in service level agreements, right? SLAs. So you might talk about, the relationship between the two teams based on the 360 assessment, how we think they ought to work, and then what sort of communication norms and things like that can we create with each other, so that way we can have better communication, reduce conflict, maybe even have conflict management strategies, because we know there's particular areas of work that always create conflict and friction, and how will we deal with those things when those things come up, and then co-create inter-team norms and agreements for how we'll deal with those things. We integrate emotional intelligence into one-on-ones with managers and into development plans. So we integrate some of that initial assessment data and ongoing assessment data, and then we integrate it into the strategic development conversations that we're having. Given what we see coming down the pike for the next, 1 to 2, 3 quarters, whatever, what aspects of emotional intelligence will help you. How do you think you're doing in those areas right now, and how can we make sure that we create space to intentionally develop the emotional intelligence skills that you need, so that as we encounter that new work, you're ready. We also have ongoing group reflection sessions. This is kind of like, maybe you could consider it like group coaching, where again, we're not talking necessarily about the specifics of work. We're talking about the cultural interactions that we're having with each other, the social dynamics that are going on and what we want to adjust with them. Most likely, you would also have continued coaching for individuals. Not everybody's going to grow and develop at the same pace. So, we don't really want to leave people behind. Everybody's just as important as the next. And so we want to make sure that people get the individual attention that they need. And then finally, again, this could be org level, it could be department, whatever scale is most relevant depending on your size and all that. But and this could be you, the EI lead for the org or for the department, et cetera. Again, we're kind of formalizing our commitment to emotional intelligence. So it's not just going to be, I would argue, it should not just be a training class that you send someone to. It should be an organizational commitment to tracking our development and growth in this area. So we would need a point person. Of course, we can take on that role for you, but that we'd have to be pretty deeply integrated, which works too as well. Department organizational feedback systems, again, a lot of that can come through in development plans. It also comes out of our own data gathering in training sessions, coaching sessions, anything like that. But we need a system to really track the growth. And that's something we can manage for you partly, entirely. It's kind of up to you. I know that's can be some extra work in there. So we can absolutely do that work, but that needs to happen. We need to be able to figure out where we started and where we are, and if it's working and what we need to change or recalibrate. This is something, again, I can't stress the importance of leadership commitment enough. Leadership coaching should start early. Even I would say you can start this at phase 1, but certainly as we start to scale, people won't get behind this unless leadership's behind this too. Oops. And then you can start doing some stuff that frankly everybody enjoys anyway. We call this org wellness programs, but that could be, it's practiced a lot of different ways in a lot of different organizations. Anything from meditation to, you see it all over the place, like yoga programs and wellness days or wellness events, as well as inter-team or interdepartmental events. Again, we're trying to deepen relationships and connections. So dedicating time for people to build those relationships that's not just work focused. And I think this most commonly happens at the team level or maybe at the department level, but what we're really trying to do is amplify collaboration across the organization. So we would try to identify, for example, teams that typically have friction or don't seem to collaborate or produce very well together, but it's important that they do. So we would, try to figure out how can we coordinate time for those people to spend time with each other and get to know each other and all those types of things. Our recommended approach for all this stuff is start small, start with a couple cohorts from different parts of the org who work closely together. There's a few reasons for that. Obviously, we want to make sure we can do some kind of change at a smaller scale before we scale it. But also, again, there's a lot of information gathering in the early stages, trying to figure out what exactly is going on inside here, and we can get a little bit of that from initial consultations. But the more time you spend in an organization, the better you understand what some of the barriers are. And a lot of times, people aren't necessarily aware of some of the challenges they're facing until somebody else comes in and says, "Oh, is this a thing for you?" And they go, "Oh, yeah." So start with a couple teams maybe that have to work closely together, and then you kind of expand from there. And the nice thing about that is, it still takes time, but the larger and larger percentages that you're scaling from, you can start to see momentum build. As more and more people are practicing these behaviors and developing these understandings. A couple of things to keep in mind, and then we'll kind of wrap up here and get to the Q&A portion. Behavior change takes time. Even if you came here today and you're thinking, well, the thing I really need most is that one person to go through a development program or experience, we're talking about behavior change, right? So it takes first and foremost, a commitment at the individual level. But then, that commitment takes time to develop. So something to think about. It kind of depends on the size of your organization. So if you're a large organization, change happens a little more slowly, and that's just the nature of it. If you have thousands and thousands of people spread apart the world globally, that's a heavy lift. And then it's the last time I say this, but I swear it's true. If you do not get leadership buy-in, if they're not kind of almost leading your marketing endeavor for this type of work and development, it is much, much harder, if not impossible. And buy-in looks like not only is leadership talking about we value this, but we are ourselves committing to our own personal development. And yeah, like I said, typically that happens through coaching, but I've seen leadership sit in on emotional intelligence classes too that are kind of basic, but show that we're all together in this. So nobody is really above this type of work. And so there's me again. Just to kind of remind us, we looked at some examples of what emotional intelligence looks like at scale. We talked about some of the challenges, why you may or may not have all of this already, and then a typical approach for how to do it. That is my email. You are welcome to write it down, email me questions, anything you want. I must sheepishly admit that this is one of my favorite topics to nerd out about. So if you just want to talk about neuroscience or I don't know, anything related to this type of stuff, I'm happy to do so. Or just anything else. I'm happy to be a resource for you. If you have any questions about these types of things. And so, yeah, let's get to Q&A. Again, the chat bar is open. If you have questions about anything that I've covered or didn't cover and you want to know more, now's your chance. Okay. So how can we determine where we are as an organization? So yeah, that's something that we do through assessment. We actually, sometimes I think now is one of those times actually, and if I'm wrong, you can quote me and I'll take the fall for it. But we typically offer free consultation. So we'll come in depending on, how deep you're going. That is something that we can absolutely handle. It would be an upfront kind of assessment conversation, trying to learn where you are, where you're trying to go, and then we would do some level of assessment. Feel free to make these. I appreciate the private comments, but you're also welcome to. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up here? Seems like we've got the long and the short of it. Again, feel free to email me if there's anything else. I can also kind of share with you some of the other stuff that Endpoint does outside of emotional intelligence. We cover pretty much anything professional skills and technical skills, usually in a programmatic fashion like this. So if there's anything else I can do to be of service to you, great. And if not, I'll hang out for a little bit longer just in case anybody wants to chat. But I wish you all a happy Wednesday and a happy holiday. And thank you all for joining.
Yeah, and Conrad, before everybody drops off, thank you again for the presentation. I did add a URL in the chat bar for anyone that is still viewing that. If we can give us just a couple of minute or two of your time giving us some feedback on today's session, be greatly appreciated, and that'll also be sent out in a follow-up email if you don't have time to do it now. But thank you all for attending.
All right, thanks everybody.